All right, everybody, here's the last video giving you some just insight and support for TPA Cycle 1. You've hopefully submitted your materials for steps 1, steps 2. Now we're going to jump into step 3 and step 4. And so just to reiterate the process, right? So you are planning a lesson in step 1. You are teaching that lesson in step 2, teaching and assessing. And then in step 3, you're reflecting on that lesson. And then in step 4, you're considering, based on your reflections, what you might do differently moving forward. So let's just start on step 3. The way they describe this, and again, I'm just reiterating, as assessors, we look at level 3 first. And then if you don't have everything that's included in step 3 or level 3, then we go to level 2. If you have everything included in level 3, we go to level 4 until essentially we find out exactly where you're at. If you don't have everything here for level 4, then we stay with level 3. If you have everything for level 4, but not everything for level 5, then we stay with level 4. It's kind of how the assessors grade. So we look specifically at level 3. So as you read through this, and I'm going to read through it with you, candidate connects the importance of knowing students' assets and learning needs to student learning. And you analyze and describe how knowing this information led to the development of instruction that is supporting, engaging, and challenging. Keep in mind those and words, right? That's not or, so you need to describe all three of these to learners, including the whole class and the 3 focus students. So if I'm honest, when I look at this and the way they describe what you need to have for a level 3, it's a little confusing to me. So I like to go to step 3 and look really at the narrative, right? And so essentially you're describing here, how did you learning about your students' assets and learning needs shape your lesson and support students' access to engagement or access to and engagement with the content? So if you describe that, it's kind of like you're going back to step 1 and step 2, right? So I learned about my students, and this is how then it helped me teach my students. And you're going to describe what you learned and then what you did. And so that's the kind of the first part of the reflection. And so going back, right? So essentially in those couple of boxes is when you're going to describe, right, that you connected knowing their assets and learning needs to what they actually learned and what you feel like they learned. And you're going to analyze and describe how knowing that information led to instruction that is supporting, engaging, and challenging, which you would put in that second box. So one thing that people miss, and honestly, I see a lot of people scoring 2s and 1s in this area, is because they don't look very closely at this top piece in bold, and it's also on top in your rubric here. And so I would make sure that you really focus in on this question. How does the candidate, and this is what you're answering, right? How do you analyze and describe the impact of your asset and needs-based lesson planning, teaching, and assessment of student learning? And you explain how the lessons supported the whole class and 3 focus students. So that's essentially what you're doing. You're analyzing and describing kind of the impact of what you learned in step 1 and what you did in step 2. And then you're explaining how what you did supported the whole class and your 3 focus students. But it's this piece right here I'm going to highlight. Citing evidence from that step and step 2. And if you go back over here to the reflection, right, citing evidence from your submission from steps 1 or 2. A lot of people start to describe like, oh yeah, I learned about this, but they don't literally use the phrase, as I talked about in step 1, or in my submission in step 1, I said this, or while I was teaching in step 2, X, Y, and Z happened. If you don't include evidence, and again, it's step 1 and or 2, so it doesn't have to be both, but if you're not including evidence that makes sense to support your answering in these questions, you're not going to do well here. You're going to automatically go down to a 2 or a 1. And so you want to make sure that's very clear. And so in this section, again, you just want to essentially reflect on step 1, step 2. Okay, what did you learn about your students? How did it shape your planning? And how did it help you support them in accessing, engaging with the content? So you can talk about both. In step 1, I learned these things, and so that helped me in step 1 also to make this plan. Or in step 1, I learned these things, and then as I taught, it actually helped my students be more engaged and have access, and the content was more challenging. So making sure you cite that evidence when you're answering these questions. Okay, question 2 here is, was your lesson plan sufficiently flexible to support all students' learning? Or did you need to incorporate specific instructional in-the-moment adaptations for particular students? Why or why not? Now, clearly, in answering that question, you're going to need to cite evidence from step 2. And so you talk about, you can even say, in step 1, I learned this and this about my students, and then I made this plan. And then when step 2 came around and I taught, you'll notice from my videos and some of the things that I annotated that I had to make some adjustments here, here, and here. And then you explain why you made those adjustments. And then in the last box, this is where you're going to get to this last piece right here. of making sure that this lesson was supporting, engaging, and challenging for not just the whole class, but for all your focus students. You really want to include that here. So how does your instructional approach support learning for the whole class and for each of the 3 focus students to achieve the content-specific learning goals? And you just described that. I would honestly write out 4 paragraphs here. Paragraph for whole class, paragraph for focus student 1, 1 for 2, and 1 for 3. So essentially that's step 3. Now when you move to step 4, now you're going to be looking at these 2, right? So candidate, you should be able to, right? Like as you self-assess your own work, you're going to use this rubric to do so. So you have to look at your work and say, did I apply what I have learned to describe future instruction for students that is designed to strengthen and extend deep content learning and academic language development? So you have to make sure you include both. And in your step 4, are you providing next steps for instruction, citing evidence of student learning assessed during the lesson? And again, I'm going to go back up here and you're going to notice now in this one, you're going to cite evidence from steps 1, steps 2, and what you just learned in your reflection on step 3. And so naturally, when you go to this piece and they ask, explain what you would do next to advance the content-specific learning of the whole class of students, right? And so as you explain that, specifically in number A, do you need to reteach any part of the lesson? You will naturally cite, again, steps 1, 2, and or 3. Now it has to be all 3, doesn't have to be and 3, just any of those steps that would naturally support your answer to this response. Again, based on what the whole class of students learned about the content you were teaching, what will you teach next? Again, that would be a natural thing that you could cite from steps 2 or 3. Well, you know, in the lesson I learned about this, or as I was reflecting about how my lesson went, I realized I might need to do this piece. And then for number 2, if you were to develop and teach this lesson again, what would you do the same or differently to improve deep learning of content and academic language for the whole class of students, and why? So again, deep learning is connected to higher order thinking, right? Academic language, you should know what academic language is, right? Those tier 2, tier 3 words that you've learned in your 4115 class. So once you write this stuff out, like, hey, you know, as I'm reteaching whether I'm going to move on to the next lesson or I need to reteach and revisit this lesson so that they get to the level that I was hoping for and that I'm fostering that academic language, you're going to support your response with evidence from those prior steps. And so again, a lot of people don't do that. And because they don't do that, they end up not doing well in these sections. So I hope this video gives you a quick overview of step 3 and 4. Really, the work that you need to focus on is just reflecting and then thinking about, now that I've reflected, what will I do next? But making sure that you cite evidence from the prior steps to support your responses. That's really what the assessor is looking for.